So we're diving into some really fascinating research on reading instruction today, specifically the work of Mark Seidenberg, who's challenging some of the thinking around the science of reading movement. And, Seidenberg's a pretty prominent figure in the reading education world, so when he starts raising questions, people listen.
What makes his perspective so interesting is that, Seidenberg was actually a key advocate for the science of reading early on. He was really pushing for this more structured, phonics-based approach, especially in response to what some saw as weaknesses in older methods.
Right, so he's not coming at this as an outsider, like, oh, I never agreed with this. He helped build this whole approach, and now he's saying, well, hold on a second. There might be a few things we need to rethink. But, and this is important, he's not saying the science of reading, or SOAR as we'll probably call it for short, is totally wrong. He acknowledges that it's had a lot of positive impact, particularly in bringing phonics back to the forefront of reading instruction. But what he is suggesting is that maybe, just maybe, the emphasis on explicit instruction, like directly teaching all these reading components, might have gone a little too far, like a pendulum that swings too hard in one direction.
Yeah, and to understand where he's coming from, we should probably start by clarifying what we even mean by science of reading. Essentially, it's this approach that really stresses explicit instruction of those core reading components. Things like phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, all those pieces. It emerged in response to this concern that older methods weren't systematically teaching kids how to decode.
Yeah, like they were missing those fundamental building blocks.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so that gives us some context. But now Seidenberg is saying, okay, but while we're busy focusing on the what we teach, those components and the how, that explicit instruction, we might be overlooking something just as important. And that something is the role of implicit learning.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting because it makes you think about how kids actually learn in general.
Yeah, and I think this is a concept a lot of parents and educators maybe haven't thought about too deeply.
Right. So Seidenberg's argument is that alongside explicit instruction where you're directly teaching, there's this whole other layer happening beneath the surface. And that's the implicit learning. It's almost like, imagine explicit learning is you building a house brick by brick. But implicit learning, that's like the foundation that had to be there first. You might not see it, but without it, the whole structure is unstable.
Oh, I like that. It's like the groundwork that needs to be in place. So how does this actually work, this implicit learning, especially with something as complex as reading?
Well, it's all about recognizing patterns, making connections, but without even realizing you're doing it. Think about how little kids learn to talk. They don't start with grammar rules and vocabulary lists. They just soak up the sounds, the rhythms, the way language is used around them.
Right, like through pure immersion.
Exactly. And Seidenberg argues that a similar thing happens with reading. While we're busy explicitly teaching kids about digraphs, vowel sounds, all those rules, their brains are already picking up on those patterns, kind of like little detectives working in the background.
So they're sort of forming their own hypotheses as they go, testing things out.
Yes. And this implicit learning, it's happening constantly, even when they're not being explicitly taught.
So that means even when a child is reading silently to themselves, there's this whole active learning process going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. Seidenberg even points to research on what's called the self-teaching mechanism.
Ugh.
Basically, the idea is that simply sounding out words mentally, even without saying them aloud, can really boost a child's understanding of phonics.
So they're running these mini experiments in their heads all the time. Fascinating. So it's not just this passive thing. Implicit learning is a driving force in how kids crack the code of reading. And what Seidenberg seems to be suggesting is that maybe, just maybe, the science of reading as it's currently often practiced isn't giving that force enough credit.
Yeah, he's basically saying we might be so focused on one type of learning that we're neglecting another that's just as crucial, and that by doing so, we could actually be doing kids a disservice.
Okay, now that's where I'm hooked. What exactly does he see as the potential downsides of this? What happens when we put too much emphasis on the explicit and not enough on the implicit? Let's unpack that. So, okay, we're saying there are these potential downsides. Like, what happens if we push that explicit instruction too far?
Well, Seidenberg's concern, and it's a big one, is that we risk overwhelming both teachers and students. Imagine, right, a teacher who feels like they have to cover every single phonics rule, every single exception to those rules, while also, trying to instill a love of reading in their students. It's just too much.
It's like they're being asked to do the impossible.
Exactly. And then from the student's perspective, Think about it. All those drills, all those rules, it just starts to feel like a chore. It kind of takes the joy out of it, right? Like forcing a kid to eat their vegetables when they just want to dig into dessert.
Right, right. It becomes about checking things off a list instead of discovering something wonderful.
And Seidenberg specifically points out how this might be especially problematic in the early years, like preschool. There's this push to get kids reading earlier and earlier. But he cites all this research that suggests that when you bombard preschoolers with these really structured literacy programs, it can actually backfire.
So instead of giving them a head start, it's almost like we're stunting their growth.
In a way, yeah. What they really need at that age is rich language exposure, storytelling, singing songs, rhyming, just lots and lots of conversations. All those things build those foundational connections in their brains.
It's like we're so focused on the mechanics of reading that we forget about the music of language, that playful exploration that sparks their curiosity.
Exactly. And this all kind of leads into Seidenberg's next point, which he calls the too much to teach, too little time problem. And basically, he's saying that if we're constantly bogged down in teaching those basic skills, even as kids move into those later elementary grades, we're missing out on something really important.
It is.
The joy of reading. I mean, we want kids to be able to explore all kinds of books, engage with those big, challenging ideas, to really experience that pleasure of getting lost in a good book.
We're so busy teaching them how to use the tools that they never actually get to build anything.
Exactly. And I think that's such a powerful image. And, to be clear, Seidenberg's not saying we should throw out explicit instruction completely. There's still a time and place for it, especially in those early stages. But it's about finding a balance.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we find that sweet spot where we're providing enough structure and guidance, but also allowing that space for implicit learning to happen?
Right, because it's not just about kids learning to read, it's about them becoming lifelong learners.
Right, exactly. And I think that's what Seidenberg is really getting at. He wants kids to reach that escape velocity where they have those foundational skills, but also the confidence and the curiosity to soar on their own. So how do we create the conditions for that to happen? How do we help them get there? So we're talking about this balance, right, between that explicit instruction where we're really laying those foundational bricks, and then implicit learning where kids are making those connections on their own. But how do we actually make that happen? I mean, what does that look like in a real classroom or even at home with parents?
Well, Seidenberg talks about creating these positive learning ecologies, which sounds kind of complicated, but it's really not. It's about surrounding kids with language, making it a part of their everyday lives. Having books around, telling stories, singing songs, just having those back and forth conversations.
Right. So it's not just about sitting down with a workbook or flashcards. It's about making language a part of the air they breathe.
Exactly. And I think that's especially important in those early years, even before they can read. Think about it. Babies are already immersed in language. They're listening. They're picking up on those rhythms and patterns. They're experimenting with sounds.
Yeah, and they're doing it because it's fun. It's engaging. They're curious about it.
Exactly. And that's what we don't want to lose sight of. It's got to be intrinsically rewarding for them. So in those early years, it's less about formal instruction and more about just creating those rich, immersive experiences.
So things like reading aloud, telling stories, even just having those back and forth conversations, that all lays the groundwork for reading success later on.
Absolutely. And not just any old books and stories either. Seidenberg talks about making sure they're engaging and exciting for the child, something that really grabs their attention and makes them want to keep listening.
So it's about sparking their curiosity, making it feel like an adventure.
Yes. And that's where the adult, whether it's a parent or a teacher, they become like a facilitator, a guide, not someone who's just delivering information, but someone who's right there exploring alongside them.
I like that. More of a fellow traveler than a drill sergeant.
Right. Exactly. It's about sharing that excitement of discovery. So, noticing what the child's drawn to, listening to their questions, and building on those interests.
It sounds like it all comes back to that balance again, doesn't it? Providing that support and guidance, but also giving them that freedom to explore and discover at their own pace.
Absolutely. And as they get older, as they start decoding more easily, tackling harder books, that balance might shift a bit. There's still a place for explicit instruction, especially when they hit those roadblocks. But it's more about equipping them with the tools and strategies to become independent learners.
So they're not just learning to read, they're learning how to learn.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's a skill that will serve them well in all areas of life. And, I think that's a message that goes way beyond reading, don't you? It's about fostering that love of learning, that sense of agency, that confidence to take on new challenges.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Mark Seidenberg's work, and it's given us a lot to think about. But if you had to leave our listeners with just one key takeaway, what would it be?
Hmm, that's a tough one. But I think it would be this. Don't forget about the magic. It's so easy to get caught up in the mechanics of reading, the rules and the skills. But at its heart, reading is magical. It's about discovering the power of language, the joy of getting lost in a story, the thrill of making those connections and unlocking new worlds. That's what we should be nurturing in our kids.
Beautifully said. It's about fostering not just literacy, but a lifelong love of learning. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. But remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep those minds curious, those questions coming, and most importantly, keep exploring that world of words with that same sense of wonder and delight.